Thank you so much for being here. I know you're not here to hear me speak, so I'm going to keep this very brief. We are so glad that you're here. A fundamental principle of art that has shaped Mary's direction of the gallery as well as my direction of the gallery is the belief that art is a conversation. And by being here, you're participating in that conversation. Our artist, Paul Flippen, is here to talk to you about this body of work, to dialogue more directly with you than just when you come in as a viewer in the gallery. As part of that conversation, we would like to invite you to leave your response. As you exit the gallery, there's a pedestal to the left of the door where you can respond to a question and just leave a little note for us that will be curated into an exhibit that will hang next summer, giving you the opportunity to more directly engage in that conversation with us. So with that, I'm going to introduce our artist this month, Paul Flippen. Paul is a military brat, something we share in common. He was born in Germany and has lived all over the United States. He's currently living and working in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he's a professor at Colorado State University.
Go Rams.
Paul is a painter and drawer, as you can see by his work, and uses layers of imagery and abstraction and metaphors through images to create a conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to share more about with us.
Hey. So I should start with thank yous. And so thank you to Newman University in general and the Stecklein Gallery in particular. Mary Warner, and she then kindly redirected me to Shannon Johnston, who is the director you just met and has been a joy to work with. It's been a really great install. We had the opening on Friday, and people actually came and didn't set fire to the art, so that's nice. I also have to start with an apology. So it's good that you're in a university setting, because when you come to a university, it's about learning, but in addition to learning the things that you're studying, it's also a voyage of self-discovery. And as I've been on campus, I too have had a voyage of self-discovery, which is that I discovered that I only packed one dress shirt, and I already wore it on the opening. And so then I learned about myself, which is that my vanity is such that it's not so great that I'm going to go out and buy a dress shirt just for you guys, but it is big enough that I feel bad about that. So there. We want to have lots of time for questions, and it's always more fun when I'm listening and nodding my head instead of prattling on. But I am going to give just a kind of quick overview of what this is. This is a series of drawings and then the text that accompany it that have to do with my father's passing. Because, you know, that's fun and what everybody wants to see. One thing that is interesting about this process is the decision-making in terms of what to tell and what not to tell. And I was trying through both the drawings and the artwork to be kind of honest and open and things like that. But there were still some things that just had to get left out. And one of the parts of the story that is actually really important to you guys didn't make it into the final work as it is on the wall, which is that there's a chupacabra in Kansas and it hates my car. So right about there, where the lovely photographer is standing, you will see a representation of the car that my wife actually drives most of the time. It's our good car. It's only 12 years old instead of 17 like mine. And it is the car that I was driving when I packed the family in to drive from Colorado to Texas when my dad had to go into the hospital in 2009, and we weren't sure exactly what was going on. And it turns out that it worked out, but it was a panicked drive the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And some point between Hayes and Colby, as we were going across I-70 at what I'm sure was exactly the speed limit, and not at all faster, I was driving, and into the headlights loomed a mythical creature, which is something that was too big to be a possum, but too low to the ground to be a coyote, and so we decided in reflection, because my wife saw it too, that it was a chupacabra. And so what it was trying to do was run across the highway as we were plowing in, and so I tried to turn the wheel and avoid it, but of course smacked right into it, and hit it such that it hit my front fender, and then it spun around the animal and then also managed to hit my rear fender too. And somewhere on I-70 is the hubcap from the rear tire that it hit. I mention this one just because chupacabra, but also I then had to duct tape the car back together to make it to Texas, and it did, and then we got back, and then I had to bolt and screw it back together. And I thought that was the end of it. However, on my way here to deliver the work, when I was driving from Colorado to Kansas on Thursday afternoon, some point between Colby and Hayes, I hear this weird rattle coming from the back of my car. And so when I eventually stop for gas, I look and I find that my rear bumper is essentially hanging on by the fact that it had been caught on the exhaust pipe. And so it's sort of melting the plastic, because that's what my fender is made out of, because I buy cheap cars. And so then I have to like shove it back on there and duct tape it on again. And I think it's the ghost of the chupacabra that I hit the first time, because it's in the same place. And so my point here is, don't go on I-70 unless you have good insurance. So those are some of the things that I left out. Some of the other things that I left out are points where I was having conversations with family members, or points where I was having conversations with Dad. And most of those I either address or tried to work into the narrative. But there are those moments that after reading, after editing, after working on it, I realized that a lot of what I had written that I needed to cut out was based on the fact that I was angry at my dad for not taking better care of somebody that I loved. And so one of the things that doing this has helped me to figure out is the kind of role that we have as caregivers, not only for ourselves, but for the rest of our family and the people that we care about. Yes?
Paul, the students have basically come in cold.
Yes.
So some of them have had a chance to read around the room, but a lot of them have not.
Yep.
So could you just kind of start at the beginning and tell them what this body of work is actually about?
Okay. In the beginning, there was the Word. And the Word was, and then there was some light, and then like trees. And then the fishes in the sea. And then we flash forward to the fact that I'm an Army brat. And when I was a kid, I kind of wanted to be my dad, because he was big and loud and funny, and those are what men are supposed to be. He also had an excellent haircut. That is now the family haircut. And so it was interesting when I became semi-adult to sort of watch the transition from Dad being Dad, the mythical creature that is perfect in every way, to beginning to recognize the way in which he was kind of changing over time. As Dad got older and older, he got sicker and sicker. He also just really didn't take care of himself. He was my height, but 3 of me wide. He had smoked for 40 years. He just was the typical American who didn't worry so much about the future as he did about, like, cigarettes feel good. And so seeing him sort of transform over the last, say, 10 years of his life was sort of sad, but then what can you do about it? And so here is the first thing I will tell you. Most of you are young, and at some point you have to realize that you outrank your parents. And so you do get to tell them to stop doing that thing that is killing them. Even if it makes you feel awkward or something like that, and that you get to have conversations about what is actually good for them and things like that, instead of doing what I did, which was just to kind of ignore it. Eventually, Dad got sick in a couple of different ways, and most important of which was that Dad was diagnosed with leukemia, which is essentially a cancer that prevents your body from making the blood platelets and other white blood cells and things like that that you need to, stay alive. While he was still figuring out and delaying what he was going to do about treatment for that, he had a stroke, and then he was in the hospital. And so now we as a family essentially had to figure out what to do. And what is fascinating about that is that even if you think you're well prepared because you have created all of the legal documents, all of the power of attorneys and medical care waivers and those kinds of things, it's not like there's this one shining moment where George Clooney in his devastatingly handsome self comes to you in that white coat and says, well, this is it. We need you to flip this switch and it'll all be over, or we need you to sign this form and we'll cure everything. There's lots of sort of gray areas where you're trying to figure out some combination of what is the right thing to do for your dad, as he would define it, but also what's the right thing to do for the rest of your family. My mom is a sort of supporting character through this, and it's been kind of really interesting to sort of figure out some of those end-of-life questions. So like I said, it's a laugh riot, and I will say in terms of the production, when I wanted to get into art, I originally was going to make comic books because comic books are cool. And one of the things that I've realized is that the idea of art as a form of visual communication, the idea of art as essentially telling a story, that there is a narrative involved, is something that has been true for my art for a long time. In this case, there was also the need to add words. And that's something that I actually wrestled with a lot, in part because I was the art professor who used to ask the students when they were struggling to figure out how to express content, which is one of the great struggles of art. Well, what are you going to do? Just write out the meaning and stick it next to your, oh. So in that sense, I suppose it's an acknowledgement of the incapacity for one art form to contain the human emotion that you're trying to express. And so the text needed the images and the images needed the text. And so then I came up with this. It's interesting to sort of watch because as Americans, we are more comfortable with the written word and interpreting it than we are with the visual words. And so it's always fascinating to kind of be in the gallery when people are trying to experience it. And you're supposed to get to the gallery and look in and kind of feel overwhelmed because it is an overwhelming topic. So the rationalization, the excuse, the permission that I gave myself in terms of being this self-indulgent was that it kind of should make us stop and pause at the threshold and consider whether or not this is something we wish to engage with. One of the other things that's interesting to watch is who reads and where they read and things like that. We have museums all over the world that have security cameras to keep you from stealing things, and social researchers will access that footage and kind of analyze how people interact with art. And one of the things that we have discovered is that the capacity for somebody to stand and stare at something is on average less than 20 seconds that we just sort of scan, and that's an average that's skewed by dorks like me who will stand in front of the Vermeer for a good 5 minutes while everybody else is trying to jostle around. And so what we have here is something that is kind of deliberately a slow read. I think one of the things that I like about having an exhibition that's going to last for a month is that I don't really expect you to start there and read your way around, but you might come in and sort of dip your toe and find a moment and reflect on that and then come back sometime. And that some of us are also in too much of a hurry to think about what we're going to do at the end of the life. And therefore, in a sort of way, we kind of put up the same blinders that I had and try to figure out how to get more pizza because that smelled good. So what we have then is something where you as the viewer get a whole lot of say on what the art is doing, and that seems appropriate. What I will say is that it's been also really rewarding for me personally to have a lot of conversations with people who see the work and then have something where it makes sense. It touches them, not because I am so eloquent, but because they've lived a similar experience, that we all get to do these kinds of things. So those of you who are in the room who have children, be really nice to them so that they're nice to you when it's time for them to make all these decisions. And for those of you who have parents who might be aging, try to be nice because they did their best. All right, that was fun. So, I'll see you. No, questions? Yes, sir.
I'm glad you said that about the gray area, because it suddenly tipped me off that that could be the title of the show. But beyond that, I found it really fascinating that I could see this being a show of images alone. I can see this being a show just with the text and the diaristic story alone. And it wouldn't be nearly as compelling without the two, and it's such an unusual choice. Will you talk a little bit about what you had to do to convince yourself? I mean, what was the process of deciding that you were going to do something that's sort of out of the box and risky?
So a lot of it was I took a year between when Dad died and starting any of this. And that was a busy year in that we had to sort of deal with the end of Dad's affairs, and then I had to move my mom, who now lives, I was about to say with me, but that implies that she's in my house, and she is not. She's 30 minutes away. I know because I get to drive that same 30 minutes about 6 times a week. I get to do things like change light bulbs for her and give her the weird spirally ones, as she calls them, although now we've moved on to LEDs, which look like light bulbs, and she's much happier. But part of that year was sort of trying to figure out, like for a while I didn't want to have to do, like, because it's such the cliche that the artist is going to like turn their life into art because we're so sensitive and we have to figure out how to express our feelings. But I did have kind of a hard time figuring out what to do with Dad, and the fact that like I said, I was kind of angry at Dad for having the nerve to die. And so thinking about that, I would also sort of have certain images that I would hold on to when I was thinking about that. And so like when we were going through Dad's things and all of the military insignias and things like that, so his rank patch becomes an image that is layered on top of a sort of abstract map of all the different deployments that we have. That's the second image back there. And it was a way to sort of think through that, but it was such idiosyncratic, personal in my head that I felt like the images were a little bit too cold. Now some of that was deliberate. Like obviously they're blue-gray because, cheerful. But also actually, like when I was making the pieces of paper, there's an intention to go from dark to light as we move around the wall. And so the images get shifts in color along those ways as we sort of come to a point of resolution. The other thing that happened is that I would try writing it out, and the writing was useful in terms of me figuring out what I was thinking about these things, but it was also a way to sort of comment on the drawings and then the drawings could comment on the artwork. One of the things that I tried to do was to also not just have it be, so how many of you are art students? All right. If anybody, good answer. If anybody ever uses the word illustrative to describe your work, they're insulting you. You should know that. Which is sort of too bad, because like what I wanted to do was to, make pictures of stuff, what looked like stuff, when I was going to art school in Texas. But I think one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that the drawings don't just illustrate the artwork in terms of it becomes like a picture book or something like that, but instead that the artwork lives on its own and communicates on its own, and the decisions about things like line and shading and line weight and how delicately versus aggressively to make a mark are all attempting to communicate. And what was interesting about then coming into the writing was that those kinds of considerations of the ways in which form can embody meaning weren't my natural tendency. So I actually wound up joining a faculty writing group and having other people read the work, which was really helpful in terms of like figuring out how to shape and rewrite it. And it went through a bagazillion, that's an art historical numerical construct, a gazillion different edits of how to change it and how to rewrite it. And what happened was that it got more and more austere as I went through the different edits, and all of my smart-ass remarks kind of fell away, because those, much like they are today, is essentially just a way to disguise honesty. And so to try to strip those away and be, if not blunt, at least raw in terms of talking about them. Part of that then became all right, so what is the way to turn it into a work? And originally my plan for the drawings, and it was just going to be drawings, is that I was going to put them in calendar format. That it was going to be, 7 to a row, and we would start on a Tuesday and we would end on a Tuesday, and then maybe people would figure out what was going on there. And in soliciting feedback, because even those of us who teach still are trying to figure out what we're doing, it became clear that that wasn't communicating, that nobody really sort of like, why is this grid skewed, and why are you missing 2 at the top and 5 at the bottom? I can do math. And so like people weren't getting the idea of a calendar, and so it became then an idea of kind of having a syncopated rhythm of the text weaving in and out. And sometimes the text gets ahead of the drawings, and sometimes the drawings get ahead of the text, and having this relationship then become kind of a metaphor for how memory works and how time works. Because like I said, I was reflecting on this a year afterwards, and part of it was like having the commemoration of the anniversary as something that I was thinking about. Mom had me drive her to columbarium, is a new word for me at least, which is the place where they put the ashes when you have had somebody that you love cremated. So we went and visited that, and those kinds of things, those sort of rituals of commemoration were also part of the experience in terms of like reflecting on Dad and thinking about that and trying to come to some sort of understanding of both him and my relationship to him, but also some sense of forgiveness that, at some point it's not his fault that he died, even though I wish that he had done things to delay that action. And so then there's the idea that sometimes the memory is the thing that really holds on. Like I can actually still remember sliding the cash under the salt shaker to leave an overlarge tip, because that was Thanksgiving morning. And the poor worker probably had a family that she wanted to get home to too, so the idea of over tipping. But it was also a moment where like there was this sort of declarative break where now I was taking care of my mom in the sense of being the one who buys Thanksgiving dinner for her because her husband's in the hospital that day. And so then figuring out kind of like these moments, but also some of them are more expressive in terms of words. See, now if I answer every question with a like 15-minute monologue, we'll get through this real fast. Yes?
Okay, so I'm looking over here specifically with the two images of the telephone, and you've got this kind of scribble effect here, here, and then I can see a little bit of a through line of some of the other kind of, a little bit here under the brain as well. And I get a sense that it's conveying an emotion, but I wanted to know why you selected that and what kind of emotion that you're conveying with that.
So I think this is where artists have this concept called artistic license, which is essentially that we get to cheat. And in this sense, like the phone image is a good example of something that is emotionally true, if not factually accurate, in the sense that my mom did not call me and have me pick up that receiver, because that is the receiver of a payphone. I found a payphone. There is still a few out there in the world. And I took pictures of them. And the idea of choosing a payphone is that when we all have the internet in our pockets, the only situations where you would need a payphone are bad. Like there's no situation where that would be the elective choice. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna turn off my iPhone and instead go find this place where I feed coins. Coins are the kind of money that happened before credit cards. And then try to call for help is almost always what you're doing. So that as an image became like the call for help. And there is, the first image is a phone, and then again with the idea of sort of cyclically and also the way in which memory washes in and out of time, having certain images that come back. So there's, like if you take the time to read the title list, although you've done enough reading, so it's okay, but a lot of them are using notations from music to talk about the way in which like we're going to have a reprise or we're going to have a coda and something comes back. So with the phone, what I did was try to use it as a symbol, try to use it in terms of its placement. You can see like as we move through the three of them that eventually I start getting more and more standing at attention. And this is like the conversations that I'm having with my mom. When she calls at first, I don't think it's a big deal because my mom calls me all the time. And so, like, there's this expectation that she's calling just to call because she's wanting to connect. The linear work was, so when I'm figuring out compositions, I work on tracing paper a lot and sort of draw things out, and that way I can sort of see how the layers are going to work before I commit to because ink is something that I'm getting good enough with that I can sort of fudge and erase when I make a mistake, but it's generally a fairly unforgiving medium, so I like to have the composition fairly composed before I really start. So I work on tracing paper, and what I did was essentially write out some of the things that my mom said, and then fold the tracing paper back in on itself, and then turn those into patterns. And then as she gets more agitated, the text gets more agitated. And so there aren't explicit letter forms in there, but they are derived from letter forms. So a curve that looks like a comma is intended to look like a comma because my mom is an English teacher and she speaks in perfect grammar. But it isn't necessarily intended to be literally legible because we've got like the text for that. So the idea of trying to work what is a metaphorical way to represent an increasing sense of agitation. So, another 15 minutes down, we're on our way. Yes, ma'am.
Were these hung in the order you drew them in, or did you do any rearranging?
I did a tiny bit of rearranging. Mostly what I did, so I am a nerd and very kind of a planner. There are those artists who discover the work while they're making the work, and then there are those of us who discover the work by sort of planning it out before we start, and I'm definitely in that second camp. And so almost all of them, like I started there and I just kept going around. One exception is I wanted, so actually this comes back to the question about the line work. Like there is sometimes more overtly and sometimes less overtly. In almost all of them, there is an image and then there is line work that's sort of weaving in and out or commenting on that image. There are a few that don't, but those are usually moments of rest. And a lot of the line work is again derived from specific sources, either like going to a map and figuring out where Dad was deployed, or writing out the conversation and turning it into line work, or some of the, like my mom. So mom is symbolized by the family heirloom of this giant punch bowl that I'm pretty sure, had there ever been a fire when I was growing up, I would have been left to fend for myself, but the punch bowl would have been saved. And so she sees this drawing, because mom has seen the drawing. She hasn't read the text because she cried when she saw the drawings, and I was just like, okay, maybe we aren't going to do that to her. But so the punch bowl, these are the lines from the ceilings of the nurses' station outside my dad's hospital room in the ICU. And you can even sort of see like the desk curves and those kinds of things. So they have like specific origins, except when we get to the very end. And a lot of what's happening with the ones at the very end are, they don't have line work because they weren't during, they were after. So I was going through my dad's tools, I was going through his personal effects after he had passed, and a couple of those changed positions as I was sort of trying to figure out the way. So the ones at the end, ultimately, like I wanted the three that are on that wall to be by themselves. And originally, the ones that are artifacts of Dad, in the sense of they were his possessions. So that's a wristwatch that Dad had, although because he was a hoarder, he had like 6 others. And those are actually the tools that my dad inherited from his dad that were kind of in this special toolbox in his garage. Whereas those other images are of the, he's buried at Fort Lewis, which is a military cemetery in Denver. And so those are images of sort of that and those ceremony. So to answer your question, yes, most of them are done in order, except for the watch used to be between the sort of still surface of water and the, those are the bullet casings from the blanks that they fired to do the military salute in his service at Fort Lewis. And I moved the watch because of time, because like that is a distinct moment. Those 3 are kind of the experience of the funeral, whereas like reflecting on Dad's possessions, of which there were so many. Get rid of your stuff. You have too much. Was a kind of different both moment, but also kind of emotional space. As you can see, I'm still sort of grumpy at Dad. The sock, for example, is an inside joke. Like, yes, it's supposed to be a metaphor for comfort care, which is the euphemism that the hospital uses for palliative care, which is essentially like, we're just going to try to make you feel better at the end. So the sock is there for that, but the sock is also there because when we were deaccessioning my dad's museum of possessions, he had 187 pairs of socks.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just too many for those of you who are trying to keep track. That's like Imelda Marcos level of insanity. And yes, he had had nearly 70 years to accumulate them, but strangely, they were not all old socks. He just had them. Anyway, yes?
So, how much of this, creating this work, do you feel like was therapy for you in dealing with your father's passing? And how much of it was creating a new work just with this idea in mind that I want to communicate this?
Yeah. You know, it's hard to say, partly because I don't know, therapy with a project like this implies a sense of resolution at the end, and I don't know that I have that. I am less angry with Dad, but I think that I haven't quite figured out everything about it, which then, you know, it turns out that people have a hard time figuring out this whole death and life and all that kind of stuff. I would say, though, that part of it in terms of communication was I felt a compulsion to commemorate Dad in a more significant way than just, you know, mentioning to my colleagues at work that I was going to be out on Friday because I was driving my mom down to, or whatever. And so I think there's that. I think one of the other things that is useful in terms of what art can do, and one of the things that is kind of paradoxical about art is that sometimes those things that are more personal actually achieve a more universal understanding than when you're trying to shout to the masses. And so to try to tell a quiet story. I mean, they're deliberately small, right? These are tiny little intimate things, partly because you don't need a billboard to say, I love my dad, but I'm kind of mad at him for dying. And partly because it always sort of feels like a personal experience, both when I was holding them in my hand and making them, but also like, they're kind of one viewer at a time pieces, right? And then when I add in the text, it slows it down even more. Like sometimes people can crowd together, but you kind of have to either know that person or want to date them. So this is your in for those of you who are, never mind. So what we're doing is creating a work that is intended to sort of speak to an audience, but doing it by kind of reflecting on one's own experience.
So one more question. You were talking about editing the work.
Yeah.
And you were talking about editing the text. And then you talked a little bit about editing the art.
Yes.
And that's something that I find difficult to explain. They are similar, you know, but could you talk about that a little bit more, about the similarities between the two and what makes them different?
Okay. Well, I think the first big difference for me is that as somebody who has been trained as an artist, knowing what to do and speaking clearly in images was much easier. Like at one point, all of the text was written in past tense, because it is something that had happened. And one of the revisions that I can credit my wife with was that she said that it felt too distant and that I was like not participating in this story. And so changing it into present tense was an idea of like making it feel real and talking about the kind of emotions that I was experiencing at the time. So that's an example of an edit that I wouldn't have come up with on my own, but by soliciting feedback, I could do that. A lot of verb choices are also things where trying to be really conscious about very specific words and the implications that this one carries versus that one, and those kinds of slow editings are things that I had to sort of consciously decide about, whereas the same kind of editing that happens in the drawings, I had a much clearer sense of knowing when it was wrong. One of the things that's also kind of interesting about the balance that I was trying to achieve with the drawing, so like I said, the ink is somewhat unforgiving in that like you can't erase it like a pencil, but because of the way in which I was painting on. So like I get the how did you do that question a lot, so I'll just answer it. This is printmaking paper. It's a kind of paper called Stonehenge paper. And I would layer acrylic paint, sometimes mixed a little bit with gesso, which is the primer that we use to keep a surface that was going to be absorbent to the ink, but also gives me that color. It also causes the ink, because it's a sealed piece of paper, to sit up for a little while. And so I can come in with a kneaded eraser, and I can't make things go away, but I can get value gradations, and so I can get a gray that way. But to get the surface, what I'm doing is layering paint and letting it dry, and then sanding back through, and then layering paint and letting it dry and sanding it back through. And that's why most of them have very kind of eroded edges, because eventually the sandpaper sort of eats away at the corners of the pieces, which seemed appropriate to these as kind of fragments of documents of history. But that also gives me a secret out. Like if I ever completely tank one, then I just sand the whole thing off and start again. And so usually my editing process as an artist is certain things are not allowed to leave the studio. But these did have a sort of artifact quality to them where I didn't want to just like tear it up and toss it in the recycling. Plus, I'm never entirely sure if I can recycle paper that's got the paint on it. Probably the answer is no. Anyway, so here, like the editing process was more like, this is a surface, and this surface is going to make it into the finished piece, but it might not have this imagery because I might have to sand back through. Although, like I said, I do plan things out, so there were only a couple that really had to get sandblasted into nothingness and then brought back to life. And there's really only one of which I'm not proud. Not tell it. Yes, we're out of time.
It's that magical time, the students have 1 o'clock classes, and so let's give Paul a hand for this. So if you have empty water bottles, make sure you recycle them. And you need to put your chair away on the way out. Anyone who can stay and ask questions, please stay. This is a good artist. Thank you.
Thank you.